does it feel to you like this is a new moment, a new industrial era? Do you see any evidence for that, or is this just the latest technology bubble that we're in?
Yeah. I think we're absolutely in a new technological era. We've had an era that has been really defined, I think, by software, and by software that has hugely propelled, I think, the consumer side of the economy, and has made all kinds of services much, much more available to a very large number of companies and so on. But what we're really seeing today, I think, is this sort of interface between extraordinary amounts of hardware. So what we would often think about as deep technology, things that are absolutely at the frontier of science and technology, new technologies to allow us to sort of 3D scan a bridge in real time and then print, some sort of repair structure, or new technology that allows us to build a drone incredibly quickly. And it's those kinds of technology, when we put them together with software and with the capabilities of artificial intelligence, that I think is bringing us into an absolutely new era and transforming industries that have really been a little bit sidelined in the world of software, that we really are seeing, I think, a huge transformation.
Mm. And how is that showing up in defense?
So I think in defense, it's showing up in a few ways. We're basically asking the question, how can we make our old traditional systems, our traditional large amounts of metal, whether it be, an aircraft carrier or a plane, increasingly more intelligent? But it's also all the sorts of new technologies, drones being probably the most sort of visible manifestation. It's showing up as saying, actually, we sometimes don't need these very large things. We need a massive amount of something very small, but with huge amounts of intelligence wrapped around it. Not just the ability to sort of move autonomously in different ways, to move sometimes without GPS, or to move in swarms. And so those are the kinds of things that we think about.
You are both in the analysis space, but also in the investment space. Before we speak about the NATO Investment Fund specifically, but just on the broader picture, talk about how this transformation changes investment decisions, and what kinds of risks do investors have to think about that they didn't have to think about when we're talking about, consumer apps that help you order food?
Sure. So maybe I can take that in two pieces of that.
Great.
So when I think about investment decision making, the first people I want to think about are the customers. And so as I'm thinking about defense technology and defense solutions, the people investing and being the customers of those solutions are often sitting in ministries of defense. They are used to buying, very large things over very long lead times from a very, very small group of companies, what we would call the defense primes. Mm-hmm. And there's an enormous transformation that innovation is increasingly in the hands of entrepreneurs, that much of this new technology is being developed by small, agile startup companies, but that have to work at pace and scale. And so they need their counterparty, their customer, to really be different. And so we're seeing a huge amount of change happen, whether it's inside the Pentagon, the Ministry of Defense in the UK, right, their counterparts in Germany and elsewhere. So then the question is, what does that mean for investors? Right? So as an investor, if I'm investing in this deep technology and these technological foundations, first, really being at the frontier of science and technology is hard. So deep tech is sort of deeply technical. It requires deep wells of capital and patience. And so I've got to be able to allocate capital to things that are complex, new and risky. And I've got to make sure that there's a path to success, and I've got a customer who's really going to want what I've got as I'm developing it. And so there is quite a lot of different risks that I've got to understand. I've got to be more technically adept. I've got to really think about this in terms of technical milestones, experimentation, and I absolutely need to understand a customer who's completely different than a classic consumer customer.
And that's so interesting. You mentioned the transformation at the Pentagon. That's something we've been covering really closely at WP Intelligence, this big overhaul, this attempt to work with startups. And yet we're seeing and hearing from industry that, okay, they've changed processes, changed structures, but there's still a culture that doesn't necessarily reward risk. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of cultural and decision-making change that has yet to happen. Are you seeing that issue in other ministries of defense that you worked at, or is that specific to the Pentagon?
No, it's definitely not specific to the Pentagon. I think we see this in every large organization will have sort of an edict from the top to transform and to take more risk, really focus on innovation. And I know from many years of working with organizations that are, very large, trying to be better customers of innovation, that quite often the leadership sort of desires get stuck with middle management. And it's not that middle managers are bad individuals, it's just that all of their incentives line up for doing the thing in a traditional way. You know, nobody ever got fired for procuring slowly from a traditional company. When you work with startups, there is risk. Not everything works, but it's only when we try new things that we push the boundaries. So I think the Pentagon, through some of its new units, and obviously things like Defence Innovation Unit that Ash Carter put into place way back when, was beginning on that journey. The changes that I believe we're seeing increasingly have to do with an understanding of risk and a greater sort of financial literacy, actually, that we're seeing inside the Pentagon, and we're beginning to see that in other ministries of defence, a willingness to speak the language of venture capital, talk to venture capitalists, understand the capital stack. How do we have to go from very early stage risk capital to private equity to sort of infrastructure investing to project financing? And really, how do we line all of that up and write contracts that absolutely help the capital get into place?
You said the Pentagon is at the beginning of that journey. Do you see it as being at the forefront among allies, or are there other countries that are further along this journey that we could learn from?
Yes. So I would say that the Pentagon has probably been at the forefront of the innovation journey for quite a long time, and people have always looked to what the US is doing. In fact, when the NATO Innovation Fund was created, much of the impetus was to say, look, the US is really doing a lot of interesting things in defense around innovation. I think the journey the new journey is very much bringing the sort of financial language, the financial instruments sort of to bear in really effective ways so that you can get what you want out of the system. We are seeing some of that happen definitely in the UK. I'm also seeing really interesting things happening out of Canada. So the Canadians, having made a very significant commitment to increase their defence spending at the last NATO summit, really sort of trying to architect an entire financial system, whether it's the discussions with the NATO Innovation Fund around participation, the Defence Security Resilience Bank, thinking about what would it take to create a sort of financial hub that would really be an important beacon in this. And so we're learning a lot from them as well.
That's so interesting. And, obviously there are two pressure points that are coming to bear here on this conversation. One is China and great power competition.
Yeah.
But the other is obviously the war in Ukraine.
Yes.
And I'm curious, as you look at the ramping up that allies have had to do in their defense capacity, their industrial capacity, what has this moment, this experience shown about where the gaps are and what needs to be addressed?
Yeah. So the war in Ukraine has, I think, been an incredibly important moment for us to understand that warfare is a terrible thing, but there are new ways in which technology shapes warfare. And I think those who think about military doctrine have thought about that and are learning day in, day out. But there's also a lot we can learn around innovation and the way innovation happens and what has to happen to really be able to be effective. And the two things that I think about are pace and scale. And so what Ukraine is teaching us is we have to be able to innovate at pace. So we have to work with agile startup companies who can be at the front line with the warfighter. And the most effective companies are the ones that can work hand in hand with those individuals, iterating and evolving their product. It may be that hardware is the same, but they can iterate on the software and the sensor systems and so on. And so that ability to innovate at pace and to really connect to the startups is the first thing we've learned. But the second thing we've learned is scale, that having 1, 2, 10, a dozen drones is not going to get us very far. To actually be effective, we've got to be able to build millions of these things. And that means industrial capacity, and it means supply chains. And so the thing that really Ukraine has shone a bright light on is the fact that, if you do what I call it, the anatomy of a drone, take a drone apart on a table and ask yourself, where do each of those components come from? Traditionally, all those components have come from China. They've come from Shenzhen. And so as countries, we are enormously dependent upon global supply chains that have largely run through China. And so there's a huge lesson about how we build more resilient supply chains so that we can produce the things we need at scale.
Well, so much to unpack there. But I want to first ask you about the Ukrainians. And there's so many companies right now in Ukraine doing incredible innovation under these conditions of enormous stress where failure is a life and death question. And I'm curious, what lessons can other companies that are going into other, no-fail systems, be it the electrical grid, be it building in space, learn from what these companies and these innovators on the ground in Ukraine are learning through the very difficult and very intense, time-sensitive circumstances under which they have to innovate, produce, and deploy?
Yeah. So I think of that as sort of crisis innovation. And when we're in a time of crisis, innovators come together, systems are really focused on end outcomes. And what that often allows us to do is to get rid of the unnecessary bureaucracy. Suddenly you don't need 100 forms, maybe you need one to actually get something done. And so the crisis and we sort of replace kind of money and paperwork with time pressure. And so we have to absolutely get things done. And so I think that's the first thing. It's very difficult to replicate that outside of a crisis. We saw that happen in COVID. We've seen it happen in Ukraine. The other thing is to be as effective as possible at these quick innovation cycles and to be able to adapt and develop as fast as we possibly can. I think the thing we have to remember is that we are innovating on top of a set of systems that have actually been developed over quite a long period of time. So, drones are not new. DJI really developed the consumer drones. They start that company, the Chinese company that made most of these FPV drones, I think was founded in 2005. So this is not actually new, but we're innovating on top of those systems. And so if I then shift that to space, you use that as an example, I simultaneously need to be able to test and iterate quickly, but with something that has to be more fail-safe. So I probably am not as willing to accept failure. But if I'm thinking about satellite systems, it again reminds me I can build lots of small systems. I can iterate and I can test them very quickly. So I think what the pressure on the system is the thing we really have to understand. We learned that from Ukraine.
That is so fascinating. Well, talk a little bit about the NATO Innovation Fund. What is the gap that it's trying to fill, and how are you doing that?
Yeah. So NATO identified a gap that across many of the allies we needed to have more capital and more expertise sort of being focused on the startup companies that were taking some of the most essential critical technologies to market and taking those technologies to market focusing on defense, security, and resilience challenges.
So give me an example. Like what does that mean?
It would mean, for example, space launch technology. So we've invested in an extraordinary company called ESA Aerospace. This is an amazing team of engineers, some of whom have expertise from SpaceX and elsewhere, who are developing a new, quicker, more fail-safe space launch technology. But we've also invested in a company called Fractile in the UK, which makes the next generation of optical computer chips. And so we're thinking about frontline defense technologies, security systems, but also resilient technologies that will build a much more resilient future economy and communications, compute, undersea cables and so on, new kinds of materials. And there was a real identification that while the US ecosystems were really working quite effectively around those sort of mission areas, there was not as much happening in Europe. And we absolutely needed a venture capital fund to really lead the way, be a kind of beacon in that new and emerging category. So the NATO Innovation Fund was set up. We're set up as a private venture capital fund, but bearing NATO's name very proudly, but we are independent from NATO. And 24 of the NATO allies decided to contribute as limited partners. And they've made a commitment to over €1 billion. And we hired an amazing group of partners who are our investment team. And they go out and they look for the best, most exciting companies, really taking those priority technologies into defence, security and resilience across those 24 nations, which are all at the moment European nations.
And are these private funds that are supplying the money, or are these governments? Or
these are governments typically either through their sovereign wealth funds or through their ministries of defence. And in fact, a contribution to the NATO Innovation Fund would count towards your NATO contribution. So it would count towards the 3.5% or the 5% that we're looking for countries to do. The extraordinary thing about this is that we can give people huge leverage, because when we invest, other private sector venture capitalists from across the world are investing alongside us. We're making sure that those companies are given the best possible set of opportunities to work towards participation in NATO exercises, towards contracts across the NATO alliance. And we're making sure that those companies are protected. We worry tremendously about adversarial capital, about hostile state actors and coming in and trying to undermine those companies. So we really work hand in hand with the entrepreneurs to make sure that those companies are well protected. So we take those two things really seriously.
So tell me a little bit about what it takes to succeed, both from the perspective of what you are looking for in a company that signals to you this company could succeed, and then secondly, what do you need to help the company with to make it succeed? Yeah.
So, as chair of the board, my job is to make sure we have the best functioning NATO Innovation Fund that we can, and we're working to be really effective in the market. I can tell you that the partners who make the investment decisions are really looking for, best-in-class technological solutions to really meaningful problems. We're not going to fund technology looking for a home. We're looking for solutions to some of the really big, significant defence, security and resilience problems. And we're looking for teams that demonstrate that sort of managerial leadership capability, but a deep mission commitment. And that's one of the things that I have found so exciting about this, is you meet these entrepreneurs and this next generation of talent is so committed to the defence, security, resilience mission. Some of that is through defence tech companies. Some of that is through, new resilient energy technologies. And so we're really seeing a very focused group of founders. And so that's what we're looking for when we invest. How do we support them? Really, it's back to those two things. We support them with pace and with scale. And so pace means really helping them crowd in the other capital that they need, bringing investment rounds together, making sure we have absolutely the best co-investors for them, and then making sure that they can actually scale so that they have enough capital and they can see a line of sight through to later stages of capital. Sure. And that's, it's an easy thing to say. It turns out to be hard to do because some of the banking structures and things make it really hard, even to open a bank account if you're a defence tech company. So there's some real frictions in the system. And then, of course, it's always trying to help support them get contracts.
Yeah. Well, we hear a lot about the valley of death, right?
Yes.
For startups, they get that initial money, but they can't scale. But how is this? What do you have to do differently? What do they have to do differently in this sector where they're dealing with a heavy defense industry that they wouldn't have to do if they were just doing consumer software?
Sure. So I think when you're doing consumer software, you're basically able to meet technical milestones and sort of commercial milestones simultaneously. So I can deploy something in a first customer. If it works, I can iterate and I can adapt. And that's given me some technical proof that it works. And it also gives me proof that a customer wants something. In deep tech and with these very critical technologies, I'm often doing a lot of technical work before I really have something that it works well enough to be able to actually demonstrate commercial value or value in the hands of a customer. And so what these companies need to try and do is to really work out what are the most effective milestones that use the capital as efficiently as possible, because that valley of death is long. And so we need to use that capital well. And what we're trying to do is work with the companies to identify what becomes some standard milestones in the defence sector, really sort of demonstrate defence readiness. So what would be the sort of proof points? Is it, actually being forward deployed in somewhere like Ukraine? Is it being a participant in a NATO exercise, something like Baltic X, which the SAC-T, Supreme Allied Command Transformation, is putting forward, bringing startups together to demonstrate something in a real world environment? Is it getting an initial contract from one Ministry of Defence and then having more evidence of a value add and then getting another one? So we're really trying to help map out those pathways to demonstrate both commercial and technical effectiveness.
No, that's very interesting. And in our interviews with defense tech founders in the U.S., we hear that a lot. Be a part of an exercise, like a tangible proof point, as you put it. That's so interesting.
But can I just say, think about the pharmaceutical industry, right? So if I'm a biotech company, I'm taking massive risk. But when I'm taking those risks, what I am able to do is there's a very clear set of things I have to do that demonstrate progress towards you being 100% sure that this new medicine works. First I have mice, then I have a phase 1 clinical trial on healthy people. And the question, I think, with these industries beginning to use frontier technology, critical technologies to solve big industrial scale, difficult problems, is I need to create those milestones. And I've got to make them up as an industry, but also I've got to develop them as an entrepreneur. And as investors, it's our job to really help support that.
That's very interesting. The other thing I wonder about is, we hear a lot from investors, from banks, about how they now, in this moment, need to really account for geopolitical risk, right? Is this all going to blow up because the tariff regime changes or export controls or whatever, supply chains? But I wonder if for what you're doing, does geopolitical risk almost work in the reverse? The fact that we expect to have a lot of geopolitical risk maybe is something of an insurance policy for these companies that they're going to continue to be in demand. How do you think about that?
I mean, look, I think we live in an era of geopolitics, and the sort of geopolitical logic and its impact on companies is extraordinary, and these are extraordinary times. If I'm an entrepreneur in some of these areas, what I know is that it is a huge opportunity. I mean, the amount of spending that is going on defence, security and resilience is massively increasing, because I know I need to have the ability to not only use innovation as a source of economic competitiveness. Innovation and critical technology leadership is really a source of power. It's a source of strategic autonomy for countries. And so I think the markets for these companies are only going to expand. Does that mean that they have to, they can ignore geopolitics? No. So we are increasingly saying to our entrepreneurs, and I say this at MIT and at the NATO Innovation Fund, you have to have a geopolitical calculus. You have to be geopolitically savvy. You've got to think about the fact that markets will shift, that tariffs will come and go, that export controls and this whole sort of apparatus of foreign investment flows are going to be part and parcel of what it means to lead and build companies in this era. But I think those are important things to understand, but they make these companies almost more valuable. Mm-hmm. And having more of these companies will make our economies, I think, more resilient to the geopolitical forces that we're obviously seeing every single day, and we certainly see here at Davos at the moment.
You said something earlier that really struck me. You talked about this new generation of founders, new generation of technologists, and how committed they are to the mission. And it made me think about Alex Karp's book, where he sort of rants against Silicon Valley and maybe perhaps the previous generation of founders who didn't want to do Pentagon contracts, who felt that somehow sullied their idealism, perhaps. And you teach students. You've been seeing students come through your classroom. Do you see that change in mindset beyond maybe the young people in Ukraine or Europeans who are maybe closer to that conflict? But is this a generational shift, do you think?
I think it's one of the biggest generational changes of our time, is the real desire and willingness of young people who have extraordinary technical and managerial capabilities and ambitions to say, I want to solve the challenges of defence and security, that building solutions to make our economy more resilient, to have more resilient energy systems, food systems and so on, is an absolute imperative. And rather than thinking about defence as a sector with a lot of stigma, we're really beginning to see this almost the opposite. We're seeing sort of a very rapid destigmatization, and we're seeing people genuinely feel like this is something that is, they are compelled, I think, to be part of this. We have something on MIT campus on a regular basis called the mission meetups. We have a mission innovation team. And it used to be that was a sort of a small group of individuals. And increasingly we see a groundswell of interest. And not only from people who have been in military service and people who continue to serve their various nations, but individuals who just think, this is how I want to spend my time. And so I feel like we're very fortunate, actually, that some of the best talent wants to think about these hard problems.
What do you think is behind that shift?
I mean, I think people want to do something that really they think makes a difference. And I think that much of what happened in Silicon Valley has created extraordinary wealth and prosperity and economic competitiveness for the United States. And those companies have been very important. But I think when you get up in the morning and you say, what problem am I trying to solve? Being more very mission focused and aligning your time, your energy to the really big problems of today, I think is something that people just feel very differently about. I do think that the war in Ukraine brought that to people's attention. And although obviously sitting in the US, sitting in Boston as I do, we are far from the front line in Ukraine, it feels very present. And I think the geopolitical environment also feels very present and something that people want to contribute to being part of the solution.
Well, one thing we always do at WP Intelligence is we ask for actionable recommendations for our readers and viewers. I'd like to start first with builders and executives. And you talked about the importance of tangible proof points and milestones. I wonder what other advice you might have for founders and executives who are building in this environment, whether it's in defense or in energy or in agriculture, but applying that transformation to these big, complex systems.
Yeah. So I think the most important thing is to really be clear about what problem you're trying to solve. So we often see extraordinary entrepreneurs coming in and they have amazing solutions. They're absolutely at the frontier of building new solutions, but really being able to be clear about what problem you're solving, share the vision of how the world will be different, but then bring it back to reality today and tell us about the milestones that you would need to hit. How would you start to transform and operate within this more complex system? And so that ability to go backwards and forwards between the big compelling vision and the very practical, pragmatic milestones is something that I talk to many, many entrepreneurs about. In fact, it's what I teach in all my classes, is really how to do that back and forth.
And what about for policymakers? We talked a little bit about the culture within some of these big ministries, but how should policymakers be thinking about seizing this moment, and what if they in fact want to see this kind of transformation, what do they need to be doing and thinking right now?
So I really hope that policymakers will recognize that the private sector is very rational and is ready and willing to invest private sector capital in some of these extraordinary technologies and these extraordinary solutions. And they will do that, and they will take risk to invest in things that they believe will be important. But at the end of the day, the government, particularly in defence, has to put contracts on the table. They have to be willing to buy and to procure. And small demonstration proof of concept opportunities are brilliant, but we also need larger contracts. And so that doesn't mean you have to put all the money up front. These can be tied to these milestones, but policymakers need to move at pace and not keep telling us that they're going to put those contracts forward. They actually need to start to demonstrate that. So that would be the one thing I'd say. The other thing is, I think, to really continue to be as curious as possible about these technologies. I don't think it's enough anymore to say, oh, it's too complicated, I don't understand. Of course, the frontier of knowledge is complex, but there's so much opportunity to learn and be curious, which then allows you as a decision maker to ask good questions. And so I always want people to ask good questions and to take one step beyond sort of the marketing and the vision to say, what are your milestones? How would we know? What risks are we taking? And let's take those together. How can we de-risk these solutions together?
So I'd like to ask you a final question that I've been asking everyone here this week. And that is, what are leaders still missing about this moment that we're in?
I think that what we're missing about this moment is that the world of geopolitics, the world of technological innovation, and the world of sort of finance and entrepreneurship are so deeply coupled and interconnected. I sometimes feel as if I participate in 2 or 3 different streams of conversation, but in fact these conversations are very, very tightly coupled, that those who are thinking about the politics of this must reckon with the fact that as these geopolitical tensions sort of ebb and flow, that has a huge impact on what entrepreneurs are doing and in turn on capital markets. And that, we really are very, very codependent and sort of understanding one another's point of view, I think, and starting to speak a shared language, I think is really absolutely essential. And I don't see quite enough of that.
That's so interesting. Fiona Murray, thank you for these fascinating insights, really getting to the heart of this question of heavy industry, AI, and the role of policy, the role of governments, the role of finance, the role of technology. I think it's one of the really most defining questions, right, of this moment. So I really appreciate you sharing all this insight.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you.